In this video, I'm going to work on coding in some slightly more advanced interaction from what we worked on in the last video, where I got the eyes to follow the touch point on the screen. So to get myself set up for that, I have pasted the code to have the sketch run full screen on a mobile device into both my sketch.js and my index.html. You can see here on the screen, I'm screencasting from my phone, so testing both in the browser and on the phone. And what I'm looking to do here is to use that tint function to tie that to the number of touches that are happening on the screen. And my goal is to have basically the transparency of the living version of myself increase as more touches are added to the screen. So essentially, by the time you're touching the screen with 4 or 5 fingers, you're looking at this skeleton version of the portrait of me. So lots of testing, lots of refreshing back and forth between the browser and my mobile device. And you can see I'm just doing some tweaks here, testing different ways to get that interaction set up. Some interesting things that I learned in this process, specifically about the touches variable, which holds an array of any touches that are happening on the screen or on the trackpad. It didn't quite behave exactly the way that I thought that it would. So I tried several different approaches to get that interaction working the way that I wanted it to. Eventually, what I settled on was using the map function to take in the length of that touches array. That essentially just gives me the number of separate places that the screen is being touched. And you can see in my emulator on the screen, each touch is represented by a little white dot. So you can see my touching the screen as I'm testing this, making changes in the browser and refreshing. So just going back and forth, kind of testing things, jumping back to the reference, looking at different iterations and different possibilities for building in the interaction that I wanted. Another interesting thing that I discovered was that tint function. So that's what I'm using to control the transparency of my 2 graphics layers. That behaves a lot like the fill or the stroke function, for example, in that it's going to affect everything that's drawn after it in the code. So I ended up needing to insert a tint function for my background layer, which is the one of myself. That one I want to be always opaque. And then a separate variable tint function that controls the skeleton layer. And that's the one that I want to become more or less opaque based on the number of touches that are happening on the screen. So you can see here, I'm finally starting to get it fleshed out and working. But of course, this is the part of the process that just takes a lot of patience, takes a lot of sort of slow, deliberate testing and refreshing and testing and refreshing. So it's important not to get frustrated when things don't immediately work, because that almost never happens in code, especially when we're trying to do something that's a little bit more complex like this. So in a nutshell, the interaction that I was going for and ended up executing pretty successfully, especially considering that I was trying to limit myself to only things that we've covered in the first 2 weeks of class, was that one finger on the screen will control the eyeballs of my living self-portrait, and then as I add more fingers to the screen, eventually the skeleton portrait will become more and more visible to the point where it will overtake the living version portrait. So you can see here, I've got this set up that's working pretty well, and I'm pretty satisfied. As one final point, I might come back and do some optimization to try to get this to run a little bit faster. I did notice it was bogging down a little bit on the phone, but that's pretty normal. You know, your phone computing power is always going to be much less than your desktop or laptop browser computing power.